Welcome to Center Stage. My name is Mark Gordon. On this program, we're going to look at the film We Women Warriors. The film follows three Native women caught in the crossfire of Colombia's warfare who use nonviolent resistance to defend their people's survival. First-time filmmaker and journalist Nicole Karsin bears witness to neglected human rights catastrophes and interweaves character-driven stories about female empowerment, unshakable courage, and faith in the endurance of indigenous culture. Tell me about the journey with this film. How did you find this story?
I moved to Colombia in 2002, and I was working as an independent journalist. My regular gig was radio with Pacifica Radio. I worked on a program called Free Speech Radio News, and I did print and photography freelance. And I was particularly interested in covering the armed conflict in Colombia, which kind of means covering what's going on in rural Colombia, because one could go visit the cities and pretty much not be very aware of what is playing out in rural Colombia and the mountains where many of these indigenous villages are. That's where the armed conflict, that's where the armed fighters are, and there's kind of like two Colombias. So as a journalist, I felt a real curiosity, and my job was to show what was not being covered. So that was where I found these indigenous communities. That's where they all are. There's 102 of them in Colombia, and they are all in rural Colombia, and that's covering stories of how they were being killed by the armed fighters on both sides, and seeing their spirit to continue onward despite pretty despicable circumstances was inspiring to me, and as well as their nonviolent stance when their worlds are engulfed by violence of all different kinds and sides. Their clarity of not using arms and their clarity of having a right to not participate in the conflict was extremely impressive.
Is there any hope for these communities?
It was in 2009 that Colombia's constitutional court made this ruling saying that 1/3 of the indigenous groups, or 34 of them, are in danger of extinction. And they set out some guidelines for the government to protect these peoples. And those guidelines don't seem to have been implemented. In fact, the Constitutional Court just ruled last month that the army, the armed forces, but the army in particular, had to leave a region in southern Colombia because they were threatening the survival of two indigenous groups.
Your film also brings up this notion that the government's denying the conflict even exists.
Because they do. I mean, that's how they did when I was there. So I can't speak much for the government of Juan Manuel Santos at this very moment in time, because I haven't been reporting like I was under his predecessor, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, but that was definitely the government line for the 8 years that I was there. There's no armed conflict.
Will you give us a brief history on how the conflict started and how it's escalated? In the 60s, it was an insurgency movement, and then the 70s brought on drug trafficking.
The roots of the insurgency is what in Colombia is known as la violencia, which is the violence. And that began in 1948 with the assassination of a populist leader in Bogota. And then there was 12 to 14 years of fighting between the liberal and the conservative parties. That was really cruel violence that occurred in the countrysides. So it was a combination of this political duel and the need for land reform.
Well, you also talk about the people that are supporting these wars, like multinational corporations and money from the U.S. government.
In the year 2000, Bill Clinton signed what was called Plan Colombia. And Plan Colombia, the idea was to contribute to strengthening the rule of law while combating the drug trade. The drug trade principally, but not exclusively, being cocaine, that is derived from the coca leaves that are grown en masse in Colombia. Plan Colombia from the get-go was mostly military. Of the U.S. aid, 80% of it was military and 20% was social development. But what I saw in my reporting was that the centerpiece of this policy was fumigations, still is. Aerial fumigations using an herbicide made by Monsanto. Folks will remember Monsanto from Vietnam.
Right, yeah.
It's similar to Agent Orange. It's a defoliant. It's to kill the coca plant. The thing is, though, is that it's indiscriminate. It's sprayed over, and people who grow coca have it mixed among their food crops. It also poisons water sources. It also kills animals. It's also caused a lot of health defects. Unfortunately, they don't have an alternative to survive, basically. I mean, to feed their kids and themselves. One of the very few options is growing coca leaves. When I first moved there in 2002, 2 years into Plan Colombia, 2 years into these fumigations, the EPA in our country had called for a moratorium that lasted for 6 months that was based on health complaints and environmental damage complaints from Colombia. And the people in the countryside, like most of the indigenous communities, are suffering these consequences. The armed fighters, the FARC, which is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which is the larger insurgency group, and then the smaller one is the National Liberation Army. They are both Marxist, Leninist, Bolivarian as well, pan South American. Everyone says that they've really changed, that originally they did have this idealism and were with the people. But ever since when I came in 2002, that was no longer. They are all involved in the drug trade. They were involved in kidnapping, and what really was difficult was just how all of the armed fighters, so the guerrilla, the paramilitaries, and the armed forces, are killing civilians. Indigenous people are killed the most because they refuse to leave their ancestral land. In Colombia, there's 5.2 million displaced people. It's recently surpassed Sudan, so now it's the largest displaced community in the world. And a lot of those people leave their land because the armed fighters are vying to control it for illicit businesses, to protect interests of multinational corporations who come in and do African palm mining, different things like that.
African palm mining? Tell me about that.
African palm or mining, I'm sorry. African palm is the palm that they use, but it's a very well-known paramilitary protected project in Colombia. And the mining, there's lots of different mining. Drummond is one of the mining companies, but there are other, Ashanti Gold, there are other ones.
Who's more frightening, the paramilitary, the insurgents, or the army?
Well, in many regions, the army and the paramilitaries are one and the same. I mean, if you talk to people in certain regions, that's how they describe it. They're this one and the same. They can take up an armband and put one back on, or they work together. They're in cohorts so much that they see them as the same group. They're all scary, though, definitely.
The film focuses on 3 women.
Yes.
What was it about these 3 women that really appealed to you, that you had to tell their story?
Well, they're all leaders, which is very interesting because while Colombia does have female leaders, it's still, especially in the indigenous world, it's still a male-dominated society. So, again, it's not unheard of, but it is exceptional. When I met all of them in extreme circumstances when they were really facing life and death situations. And I saw how they negotiated and used different forms of nonviolence, from just speaking out, which in Colombia, speaking out against a massacre, it sounds rather simple, but it actually is a very brave move and can put your own life on the line, to personal resilience and enduring a lot of suffering, imprisonment. One of the women, Ludis, was imprisoned on false charges of rebellion and was imprisoned for a year while her children were outside and her husband had already been murdered, so she was already a widow.
And is that fairly common for the army to do that, to falsely accuse?
That was a tactic under Alvaro Uribe Vélez. That was the mass detentions tactic. People that live in the rural areas, a lot of them are civilians, but some of them are insurgents in civilian clothing. So the idea is if you capture 400 of those 400, maybe you'll get 2 or 3, or I don't know. It was a pretty extreme policy, and a lot of innocent people were in prison for a long time.
What did you learn about this culture from this experience?
I learned that, resilience is resistance, as is Ludis, the woman who was imprisoned. She has lived and endured so much, and she's still able to laugh, laughter and being able to make a joke and really enjoy life despite a lot, I think is the power of the human spirit, and the triumph of that to me was really impressed me greatly. And I think that Colombians as a culture, I think that within Colombian, and I think the Colombian culture in exile, because there is, quite a few, in New York, New Jersey, Spain, all over. I think that they are people that I think most families have been touched by the armed conflict in some way or another, have had some kind of loss to the violence.
What's the one thing you'll take away from the process of making this film?
There's so much, but I just feel like the three women in my film, I feel very touched by all of their inspiration, their wisdom, their like belief in nonviolence, the belief in indigenous rights, and having their villages militarized, being imprisoned, having your life threatened. All of these things are extremely drastic, and yet they've been able to transcend these situations with somewhat of a sense of like serenity, not all the time, but that's how they come out of them, which is so impressive to me.
So what would you like an audience to go away with after they see your film?
I guess I would like an audience to go away with more questions about the Colombian conflict. I certainly don't pretend to explain that whole convoluted situation in my film. I try to explain enough context so that people can understand the three characters' stories and like understand the conflict in relation to their lives. But I hope it like provokes more questions and that people go and like look it up and understand, want to learn really more what's going on and maybe our government's role, because it's a humanitarian crisis. So like how we're contributing to this humanitarian crisis.
Just a reminder, you can hear Center Stage live every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on KXLU Los Angeles, 88.9 FM. We're also streaming live on the internet at kxlu.com. Until next time, this is Mark Gordon, and I'll see you Center Stage.